Hello guys, welcome you all to the Insights into Books podcast. Before we start, kindly follow or subscribe us, and if you want daily summary files of these books, then subscribe us on Gumroad. Links are in description. Now, let's start today's discussion, guys. We are embarking on a deep dive today into, well, one of the most transformative concepts in modern mental health. Really shifting things. It's this idea that psychological distress, trauma, it's not simply an issue of the mind, not just thoughts and feelings floating around.
Exactly. It's about the entire person. We're exploring the physiological, the whole body impact of overwhelming experiences.
Right, moving past that older view where distress was seen maybe as just a mental weakness or an emotional problem you just had to get over.
For far too long, the default approach, in therapy was often treating the symptoms, the anxiety, the depression, maybe addiction.
With tools mostly aimed at the thinking brain, the part that talks.
Precisely. But the paradigm shift we're really digging into today is, frankly, revolutionary. It argues that trauma leaves a deep physical imprint.
An imprint, literally changes you physically.
Yes. It reshapes the nervous system.
Yeah.
It affects the very architecture of the brain, the parts we rely on for survival. So understanding this fundamental change where trauma actually lives in the body, that's the absolute critical first step. It changes how we even think about healing.
Okay, let's unpack this then, starting right at the core. That fundamental argument that really changed the conversation, the somatic imprint, the body keeping score. If traditional talk therapy focuses on creating a coherent story, a narrative, why does it often fall short for people who's been through really profound trauma?
Well, it often falls short because of how the brain handles traumatic memory compared to, say, an ordinary memory. It's fundamentally different.
Different how?
Okay, think about what you had for breakfast this morning. You recall it, it's organized, it has context, maybe a beginning, middle, end. It gets stored, mostly in the frontal lobe as an explicit verbal story.
Makes sense. I can tell you about my coast.
Right. But in a moment of extreme fear, extreme helplessness, the more sophisticated parts of the brain, the ones responsible for creating those neat linear stories, they actually shut down.
They go offline.
They go offline. The emotional brain, the feeling brain, what we call the limbic system, it completely takes over. Survival mode kicks in.
So if the storytelling part is offline, what do we get instead of a story?
We get fragmentation. Traumatic memories aren't stored like a neat ribbon, like your breakfast memory. They're stored more like, well, the analogy often used is shards of glass.
Shards of glass, meaning?
Meaning disconnected sensory bits, emotional fragments, physical sensations. It could be a specific smell, a sound, a feeling of pressure on your skin, a terrifying image, just pieces.
And these pieces, these shards, they aren't connected into a narrative.
Crucially, no. They lack context. They often lack a timestamp. They don't have a verbal description attached easily. And because they're fragmented like that, they're incredibly easy to trigger later on just by everyday life.
Okay, so a random sound or smell could suddenly bring one of those shards right to the surface.
Instantly. And when those fragments get triggered, the implication for the survivor is, well, it's terrifying. Because it's not just remembering the past event.
It's reliving it.
Exactly. It feels like it's happening right now. Because the memory is fragmented and stored implicitly and non-verbally in the body, in the feeling brain, the body, and that part of the brain believe the trauma is current. It's happening again.
So the person gets flooded with the same chemicals, the same physical feelings they had during the original trauma.
Precisely the same chemical cocktail, the same terror, the same physical sensations. They get plunged into an involuntary flashback. It's like the body's memory system is dictating reality.
And this whole process completely bypasses the rational thinking part of the brain.
It totally bypasses it, which is why you can intellectually know you are safe in the present moment. You can tell yourself, I'm okay now, but your body is still vibrating with terror. Your feeling brain hasn't gotten the memo.
Okay, this is where it gets really, really interesting. The neurobiology. If the feeling brain is kind of running the show now, what happens to the actual physical structure of the brain when it's repeatedly exposed to that kind of overwhelming terror? Does it physically change?
It absolutely does. Trauma structurally alters the fundamental systems we need for survival, for living well. It compromises our capacity for pleasure, for engagement with the world, for self-control, for connection, for trust.
So it's like the brain's internal security system gets permanently dialed up to the highest alert level.
That's a great way to put it. You see a clear functional breakdown in certain areas. The system is rewired for danger.
We need to understand this relationship then between what gets called the smoke detector and the watchtower in the brain. How does that interaction get messed up by trauma?
Okay, so the amygdala. That's our brain's smoke detector. It's constantly scanning the environment for potential danger. It's meant to keep us safe.
Right, essential function.
Essential. But after trauma, the amygdala becomes profoundly hypersensitive. It starts seeing danger everywhere. It misinterprets normal, everyday situations, maybe a loud noise, a particular tone of voice, even just a crowded room as life-threatening emergencies.
So it's constantly sounding a false alarm.
Constantly. And this leads to that chronic stress reaction, that hypervigilance. The survivor feels perpetually stressed, jumpy, irritable, because their internal alarm system is screaming, danger is imminent, even when it isn't.
And while that alarm system, the smoke detector, is blaring, the part of the brain we need to rationally assess the situation and turn off the alarm that goes offline too.
That's the other critical piece, the prefrontal cortex, or PFC. That's the watchtower. It's responsible for our higher-level thinking, conscious decision-making, planning, impulse control, and crucially, recognizing that a current situation is actually safe, distinguishing past from present.
The part that says, okay, loud noise, but it's just a car backfiring, not danger.
Exactly. Now, during an actual traumatic event, it makes sense for the PFC to shut down temporarily. You don't want to be logically analyzing options when you need to react instinctively to survive.
You need pure reaction.
Pure reaction. But if the trauma is ongoing or particularly severe, the PFC can remain impaired long-term. It doesn't come back online properly. And this prevents the rational brain from doing its most crucial job, accurately assessing risk and recognizing safety now. Trauma fundamentally becomes a disorder of prediction. The brain keeps predicting danger based on the past.
And when the PFC, the watchtower, is offline, the brain defaults to its most primitive functions, right?
Yeah.
The so-called reptilian brain takes over.
Yes. It defaults back to the brainstem and the limbic system. It triggers the basic survival responses. We all know about fight or flight. You fight back or you run away.
The classic responses.
But what if you can't fight back? What if escape is impossible? Think about situations like sexual assault or being physically pinned down or childhood abuse where the threat is often a caregiver you depend on. You can't fight, you can't flee.
So what happens then?
Then the brain activates its last resort, its most ancient emergency system, the freeze response, or sometimes called the shutdown mode.
Freeze, like a deer in headlights.
Very much like that, physiologically. This involves activating a specific part of the vagus nerve, the dorsal branch, which essentially slams the brakes on the entire system. Heart rate drops, muscles might go limp, you might feel completely paralyzed.
And the source material really emphasizes that this immobilization, this freeze response, is often at the very root of long-term traumatic symptoms. Why is freezing so deeply consequential?
Because it is dissociation. It's a profound disconnection from the self, from the body, from the present moment. The body goes numb to survive overwhelming pain or terror. The person detaches. They might feel like they're watching the event happen from outside their body, like it's happening to someone else.
A way to mentally escape when you can't physically escape?
Exactly. It's a brilliant survival strategy in the moment. But here's the cruel paradox. This shutdown mechanism doesn't just turn off the danger signals or the physical pain. It deadens the ability to feel anything deeply.
Anything, including positive things.
Including positive things. Long after the actual danger has passed, the person can remain stuck in that state of internal numbness and disconnection. They find it hard to experience joy, connection, love, a sense of vitality. They feel, well, frozen in time. Cut off.
So this chronic alarm state from the hypersensitive amygdala, coupled with this potential for internal numbness or shutdown from the freeze response, what does that do to the physical body over the long haul? You said that the body talks back.
It absolutely talks back, often through physical ailments that seem to have no clear medical cause. Doctors run tests, nothing shows up, but the person is genuinely suffering.
Because the root cause isn't a typical physical disease process.
Exactly. The root cause is often the chronically dysregulated nervous system. When your body is constantly diverting all its resources towards a perceived survival threat, fight, flight, or freeze, it simply cannot perform its normal maintenance and regulatory functions properly.
So what kinds of physical problems do we see cropping up?
The range is incredibly wide because, think about it, the nervous system touches every other system in the body. We see significant correlations between trauma histories and things like chronic pain headaches, migraines, debilitating back or neck pain, often from years of unconscious muscle bracing.
Holding tension without realizing it.
Constantly. Also, profound digestive issues, irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, spastic colon, other gut problems. The gut-brain axis is hugely impacted. Then there are conditions like fibromyalgia, characterized by widespread pain and tenderness, and chronic fatigue syndrome. The body is just exhausted and hurting.
And this connects directly to something you mentioned earlier, that idea of disconnection, but specifically disconnection from our internal body signals. Interoception, right?
Yes, interoception. This is so critical. Interoception is our internal sensory system. It's the ability to accurately feel and interpret signals coming from inside our bodies.
Like knowing when you're hungry or thirsty or tired.
Exactly. Or feeling pain or temperature changes or your heartbeat. But it also includes sensing more subtle things, like the physical feeling of safety versus unease, or knowing your own emotional state through its physical correlates.
And trauma disrupts this.
Profoundly, trauma survivors often learn to shut down their capacity to feel these internal sensations, especially if parts of their body were involved in the trauma or became sources of pain. They might numb out large areas.
What's the consequence of losing that internal connection?
It's huge. If you can't accurately feel pain signals, you might ignore a serious injury or illness. If you can't feel your internal cues for hunger or fullness, it can lead to disordered eating. If you can't sense your own internal state of unease or safety, how do you recognize your own boundaries in relationships? How do you trust your gut instinct? How do you even feel joy or pleasure fully if you're numb inside?
Wow. Essentially, if you can't read your own internal operating manual accurately, you lose the fundamental ability to self-regulate. You can't set healthy boundaries. You can't make good decisions for your own well-being.
Absolutely. That loss of internal awareness creates this foundational disconnect from the self. It makes self-care incredibly difficult.
And when we look at this through a clinical lens, recognizing this physical bodily root cause changes everything, doesn't it?
It changes the entire landscape. We stop seeing things like anxiety, depression, PTSD, or dissociation as purely mental disorders isolated from the body.
We see them instead
As symptoms,
No.
as manifestations of an underlying implicit bodily memory of trauma that hasn't been processed or resolved. And when you address that root cause, the dysregulated nervous system, the fragmented sensory memories, you have a chance for genuine lasting healing rather than just managing the surface symptoms.
That brings us to what is perhaps the most devastating manifestation of this, childhood trauma. Because a child's brain is still developing, it's so plastic, so dependent on the environment. The impact of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, seems uniquely profound and long-lasting.
It truly is an assault on development itself. A young brain is literally wiring itself based on its experiences, and it's fundamentally wired for attachment. An infant needs a consistent, attuned, responsive caregiver to learn how to regulate their own emotions, to feel safe in the world.
That's the foundation for everything later, isn't it?
Yeah.
Secure attachment.
It's the bedrock. But what happens if that primary caregiver is inconsistent, neglectful, or, terrifyingly, if the caregiver is the actual source of fear and danger?
The child can't form that secure base.
They can't. This often leads to what's called disorganized attachment. The child is trapped in an impossible biological paradox, a survival bind. The very person they instinctively turn to for comfort and safety is also the person causing them terror or pain.
That must be incredibly confusing and damaging for a developing nervous system.
Deeply damaging. The inability to establish that foundational sense of trust, that core feeling of safety in the world and in relationships, has horrifying consequences that ripple throughout the person's entire life.
We really need to look at the statistics here. Connecting high ACE scores, multiple adverse childhood experiences, to adult health and well-being. Because as you said, this isn't just a mental health issue. It's a massive public health emergency.
The data is stark, it's undeniable, and frankly, it's heartbreaking. Individuals who experienced a high number of ACEs, say 4 to 6 or more different types of trauma like abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, are dramatically more likely to suffer serious problems as adults.
Like what specifically?
We see significantly increased rates of chronic depression. Suicide attempts are reported to be thousands of times more likely in some high AC groups compared to those with 0 ACEs.
Thousands of times. That's staggering.
It is. We also see about 7 times the likelihood of developing alcoholism, significantly increased rates of IV drug use, and tragically a higher likelihood of experiencing further trauma later in life, a cycle of re-victimization. For example, adult survivors of child abuse are reported to be significantly more likely, perhaps 6 times more likely, to experience rape as adults.
It sets up a vulnerability. But the consequences go beyond mental illness and behavior,
Ooh.
right? They connect directly back to physical health and even how long people live.
They absolutely do. And this is where the physiological mechanisms we've been discussing really connect the dots. The chronic stress experienced during critical developmental periods in childhood leads to prolonged exposure to stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline.
Which isn't good long term.
It's very damaging long term. It causes systemic inflammation throughout the body and can permanently dysregulate the stress response axis, the HPA axis. Over decades, this chronic wear and tear, this inflammation, drastically increases the risk for the leading causes of death in adulthood.
Like heart disease, cancer.
Exactly. Heart disease, stroke, cancer, diabetes, respiratory diseases, liver disease. The physiological damage starts in childhood and accumulates over a lifetime.
It's hard to overstate the importance of this finding then.
It really is. When you look at the data, it strongly suggests that child abuse and neglect is arguably the single most preventable cause of mental illness and a major, major contributor to premature death from these leading chronic diseases. Prevention and early intervention are critical.
Okay. Given the devastating scale of this, particularly for those who endured trauma early in life, the focus absolutely has to shift towards hope, towards healing. If the trauma is stored physically, imprinted on the body and nervous system, then the solution must also engage the body, right?
Absolutely. That's the core philosophy of this new paradigm of healing. It requires moving beyond approaches that primarily target the thinking brain, the top-down methods.
Because the thinking brain, the part that uses language, just can't reason away or abolish these deeply held physical sensations and implicit memories stored in the feeling brain.
Precisely. You can't just talk yourself out of a visceral body memory. Trying to force someone to verbally confront traumatic memories, especially when they're already in a state of high physiological arousal or panic, can be ineffective.
Oh.
Or worse.
It can actually make things worse, lead to re-traumatization.
It absolutely can. If the body is already screaming, danger, and you force it to revisit the source of that danger without the tools to regulate, you can just re-trigger the entire traumatic response, reinforcing the fear pathways rather than resolving them.
And we even see this shutdown reflected in the brain's anatomy during traumatic recall, don't we?
We do. Brain imaging studies have shown something fascinating. When survivors are asked to recall intense traumatic experiences, the part of the brain responsible for speech production, Broca's area, often shuts down significantly.
They literally can't find the words.
They literally lose the capacity for articulate speech in that moment. The brain is prioritizing survival signals over generating a coherent verbal narrative. And this just highlights why talk therapy alone is often insufficient for deep trauma. If the brain systems needed for talking about it are offline during recall, we clearly need methods that can bypass language.
So the goal then becomes bridging this rift between the thinking brain, the narrative self, and the feeling body, the container of sensation and implicit memory.
That's the core task. And the good news is we can leverage the brain's own capacity for change, its neuroplasticity. The brain can reorganize itself, it can heal, it can form new pathways.
And the way to encourage that healing is through these bottom-up approaches, methods that engage the body and nervous system directly.
Yes, methods that work from the body up to the brain rather than just from the brain down. But, and this is non-negotiable, this path always has to begin with reestablishing a foundational sense of safety, both physical safety in the environment and internal physiological safety.
You can't do trauma work if the alarm bells are still ringing full blast.
You absolutely cannot. The nervous system has to feel safe enough first before it can even begin to process the traumatic material. Once that relative safety is achieved, then we can start deploying these powerful, targeted modalities designed specifically to access and release that stored somatic memory.
Okay, let's dive into some of those specific tools. The ones that maybe at first glance sound a bit like crazy nonsense, as some sources put it, but actually have really profound clinical support. First up, EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. What's going on there?
Right, EMDR. It often involves having the patient hold the traumatic memory in mind while simultaneously engaging in bilateral stimulation. This usually means following a therapist's moving fingers or a light bar with their eyes side to side, or sometimes holding small buzzers in each hand that alternate vibration, or listening to tones that alternate between ears.
Side-to-side stimulation while thinking about the trauma. How does that help?
Well, the exact mechanism is still debated, but the leading theory is that this rhythmic side-to-side stimulation helps the brain process the stuck traumatic memory. It seems to mimic some of the processing that happens naturally during REM sleep, our dream sleep state. It helps the brain take those fragmented shards of glass we talked about and integrate them, consolidate them into a more coherent, less emotionally charged memory.
So what's the ultimate therapeutic shift? What changes for the person?
The crucial shift is moving from reliving the trauma, where the body and emotions are currently activated as if the threat is still present, to remembering it as something that happened in the past, something that is definitively over now. The memory itself doesn't disappear, but the intense physiological charge, the terror, the flashbacks, those get stripped away or significantly reduced.
And the results can be quite dramatic and relatively quick sometimes.
The efficacy data is often very compelling. Several studies have shown significant success rates with EMDR, sometimes outperforming traditional talk therapy or even certain medications for PTSD in controlled trials. For instance, one study mentioned found that months after treatment, a high percentage, maybe around 60%, of the subjects treated with EMDR were assessed as being completely cured of their PTSD symptoms.
That's remarkable.
And what's also fascinating is that EMDR seems to work even across language barriers when the patient and therapist don't speak the same language. This strongly suggests it's bypassing the need for the rational, verbal brain and connecting directly with that deeper implicit memory system.
Okay, so that's EMDR for reprocessing memories. Let's move to another key bottom-up approach, one focused more on self-regulation and reconnecting with the body. The power of movement and mindfulness, particularly practices like yoga.
Yes, yoga and mindfulness practices can be incredibly powerful tools for trauma survivors. Why? Because they gently encourage the person to turn their attention inward, to be present with their physical sensations and their breath in a safe and structured way.
Which is often the very thing survivors have learned not to do, right? They've learned to disconnect from their bodies because the body felt like an enemy or a dangerous place.
Exactly. So yoga, with its focus on mindful breathing, specific postures, asanas, and paying attention to bodily sensations without judgment, helps survivors slowly and gently re-inhabit their bodies. They learn, maybe for the first time, that they can exert some conscious control over their internal state. They can use their breath to calm their nervous system, to mitigate that automatic hyperarousal response.
Is there a way to actually measure this change in nervous system regulation?
There is, actually. A key physiological marker is heart rate variability, or HRV. HRV measures the natural variation in time between consecutive heartbeats. A healthy, flexible, resilient nervous system can adapt quickly to changing demands, leading to high HRV.
And a traumatized system.
A traumatized nervous system is often stuck in survival mode, either hyper-aroused, fight-flight, or hyper-aroused, freeze-shutdown. This rigidity leads to low HRV. Practices like yoga and mindfulness, especially those emphasizing slow, deep, diaphragmatic breathing, directly help to increase HRV.
How does deep breathing increase HRV?
Slow, deep breathing stimulates the vagus nerve, specifically the ventral vagal complex associated with social engagement and safety. This signals to the brain that the body is safe enough to relax, shifting the nervous system towards a state of calm and connection, which is reflected in higher HRV. And research has backed this up. Some studies have shown yoga to be a highly effective intervention for PTSD, sometimes demonstrating effects comparable or even superior to certain studied medications.
So reclaiming the body through mindful movement and breath. Then we have another, perhaps even more specialized body-focused approach, somatic experiencing, or SE. What's the focus here? How does SE help release trauma that might be physically frozen?
SE works directly with the idea that trauma isn't just the event itself, but the energy that got trapped in the nervous system when the natural survival responses, fight or flight, were overwhelmed or couldn't be completed. That energy gets literally frozen in the body as physiological tension, bracing patterns, or suppressed impulses.
So the body still holds the intention to fight or run, even years later.
Precisely. SE helps the person gently become aware of these physical sensations, the felt sense associated with the trauma. Maybe a tightness in the chest, a knot in the stomach, a feeling of wanting to push away. The therapist helps the client track these sensations without getting overwhelmed.
And then what? How is the frozen energy released?
Then, in a very careful, titrated way, the therapist facilitates the completion of the physical defensive action that was blocked or interrupted during the original event. It's about allowing the body to finally do what it needed to do then, but couldn't.
Can you give us an example? What might completing the defensive movement look like in a therapy session?
Sure. Let's say someone was assaulted and pinned down. Their instinct might have been to push the attacker away, but they were overpowered and froze. In an SE session, as they gently touch into that memory and the associated body sensations, the therapist might guide them to slowly, mindfully, and deliberately complete that pushing motion, maybe pushing their hands against the therapist's hands or against a cushion.
So they physically enact the impulse in a safe space.
Exactly. They allow that stored motor pattern, that pent-up survival energy to finally discharge through the body. This discharge can manifest physically in various ways, maybe shaking, trembling, heat, or deep, involuntary breaths or sighs.
And a result.
By allowing the body to finally complete the action it was prevented from taking, the nervous system can release the trapped activation. It signals that the threat is truly over, that the protective response has been successfully executed. This often leads to a profound sense of relief, relaxation, and a feeling that that piece of the past is finally resolved, integrated. And again, studies looking at SE have shown significant positive effects, indicating large reductions in PTSD and depression symptoms for many people.
That's incredibly powerful, allowing the body to finish its story. Okay, and then there's the high-tech approach you mentioned, neurofeedback, trying to retrain the brain's actual rhythm directly. How does that work?
Neurofeedback is essentially a way to help the brain learn to regulate its own electrical activity, its brain waves. You can think of a healthy brain operating like a finely tuned orchestra, with different sections playing in harmony at different times depending on the task.
And trauma disrupts that harmony.
Trauma can throw that orchestra into total cacophony. Some sections might be playing way too loudly all the time, like the fast beta waves associated with anxiety and hypervigilance. Other sections might get stuck repeating a single, slow, discordant note, like excessive slow waves seen in dissociation or shutdown, or the communication between sections breaks down.
So how does neurofeedback retrain the orchestra?
It uses technology to give the brain real-time feedback about its own activity. Sensors are placed on the scalp to monitor brainwave patterns. This information is then translated into some kind of signal for the patient, often a visual display, like a video game that only plays smoothly, or a movie that stays bright when their brainwaves are in the desired target range.
So the brain learns, subconsciously almost, how to produce the calmer, more regulated brainwave patterns simply because it wants the game to continue or the movie to play.
Exactly. It's a form of operant conditioning for the brain itself. For instance, if someone is stuck in that hypervigilant state, the system might be set up to reward the production of slower, calmer, alpha or theta waves associated with relaxation and focus. The brain gradually learns how to shift itself into a more balanced state.
And this can be particularly helpful for people who are severely traumatized.
Yes, neurofeedback can be a critical preparatory step for some individuals. Often people with severe complex trauma are so dysregulated, so easily triggered, that they literally cannot tolerate traditional talk therapy or even some other somatic therapies initially. Their nervous system is just too reactive.
So neurofeedback helps them calm down enough to even engage in other therapies.
It can be the key that helps them achieve enough internal stability and regulation to then be able to tolerate exploring their trauma history, engage with EMDR or SE, or even just benefit from relational therapy. It helps them regain a foothold, a sense of internal control, and reconnect with a feeling of self.
That idea of regaining internal control, maybe finding an internal conductor for that brain orchestra, seems perfectly mirrored in another approach, sometimes discussed alongside these internal family systems, or IFS. How does IFS fit into healing the internal chaos trauma creates?
IFS offers a really beautiful and compassionate way to understand the internal landscape after trauma. It suggests that our psyche isn't monolithic, but is naturally made up of various parts or subpersonalities. Trauma doesn't create these parts, but it forces them into extreme roles.
Extreme roles, like what?
Well, you might have manager parts that try desperately to keep everything under control, to keep you functioning, perhaps by being perfectionistic or overly critical. Then you might have firefighter parts that react impulsively when emotional pain surfaces. They try to extinguish the fire of that pain quickly, maybe through things like substance use, binge eating, or self-harm.
And these protective parts are trying to shield something deeper.
Exactly. They're protecting the exiles, the young, vulnerable parts of us that hold the original pain, fear, shame, and burdens from the trauma. These exiled parts are often frozen in the past, and the managers and firefighters work hard to keep them locked away so their overwhelming feelings don't flood the system.
So where does healing come in, according to IFS?
Healing comes from accessing and strengthening what IFS calls the self. The self isn't a part. It's conceptualized as the core of who we are, our innate essence that is inherently calm, curious, compassionate, confident, creative, courageous, and connected. Even in the most traumatized individuals, the self is believed to be undamaged, just obscured by the protective parts.
So the goal is to access that core self.
Yes. The goal of IFS therapy is to help the person differentiate from their extreme protective parts and access more of this self-energy. From that place of mindful self-leadership, they can then approach their protective parts with understanding and appreciation for their efforts, and crucially, they can connect with their wounded, exiled parts with compassion.
To offer them healing, to unburden them from the past.
Precisely. The self can witness the exile's pain without being overwhelmed, offer them what they needed back then, and help them release the extreme beliefs and emotions they've been carrying. This allows the protective parts to relax their extreme roles, bringing the whole internal system into greater balance and harmony. The self becomes the loving conductor of the internal orchestra.
That makes so much sense. Connecting with compassion to the parts of ourselves that are hurting. Now, if we connect this back out to the bigger picture, recovery seems profoundly relational, doesn't it? Trauma itself often happens in relationship or breaks our relational trust. How critical is community and connection in the healing process?
Oh, it's absolutely essential. You really can't overstate it. Human beings are fundamentally social creatures. Our brains, our nervous systems are wired to co-regulate, to function optimally within a supportive social group, a tribe, if you will.
And trauma does the opposite. It isolates.
Trauma shatters trust. It forces isolation, physically and emotionally. And that isolation only reinforces the physiological patterns of danger, of being cut off, frozen, unsafe. So rebuilding a sense of safety must involve safe relationships.
What kinds of relationships help?
It can be the therapeutic relationship itself, with a therapist who is attuned, responsive, and provides that safe container. It can be support groups, veterans groups, 12-step programs like AA, survivor groups where people find understanding and belonging with others who get it. Even relationships with safe, attuned animals in animal-assisted therapy can be incredibly healing for the nervous system. The key is experiencing safety in connection with another being.
The source material also highlighted something really interesting, the power of rhythmic communal activities. Things like therapeutic drama or communal singing, or even certain types of dance or movement therapy. Why are rhythm and mutual cooperation so therapeutic?
Because remember, trauma often involves being frozen, stuck, out of sync both internally and with the world. Rhythmic action is inherently regulating for the nervous system. Think about rocking a baby or chanting or marching.
It's calming, organizing.
Exactly. And when you engage in activities that require mutual cooperation and synchrony, like dancing together, drumming in a circle, creating theater collaboratively, you are actively breaking those patterns of immobility and isolation. You learn to physically synchronize your body and rhythm with others.
What does that synchronization do physiologically?
It directly engages the ventral vagal part of the nervous system, the social engagement system we talked about with HRV. Moving together, creating together, signals safety and connection to the brain at a very deep pre-verbal level. It helps people come out of freeze or fight-flight and back into a state where they can connect.
And therapeutic drama, specifically. How does acting help?
Acting is particularly powerful because it often requires the survivor, who may feel numb or disconnected from their emotions, to consciously reconnect with their inner emotional landscape in order to portray a character or a scene, but they do it within the safe container of the dramatic structure. They get to practice feeling and expressing emotions, maybe anger, grief, joy, through their body, through physical embodiment, in a way that might feel too overwhelming in real life initially.
So it's like relearning the language of emotion through physical expression.
Yes. And that relearning, that reclaiming of emotional expression through the body within the safe context of the group or the play translates directly into regaining ownership of their body, their mind, and their emotional range in their everyday lives.
Ultimately, then, this entire therapeutic journey through all these different modalities seems to be about this core theme, reclaiming ownership.
That's the crux of it.
Learning how to inhabit your own skin again. Learning how to be fully present in the here and now, feeling safe and grounded in your body, rather than being constantly pulled back into the past or hyper-alert about the future.
That is the ultimate achievement. Moving from feeling like a passive victim, held hostage by these implicit memories and body states, to becoming an active participant in your own life, anchored in the present moment, with choice, with agency.
Okay, but this brings us to an important point of discussion. We have to be critical, right? While this whole framework, this focus on the body, has offered immense hope and driven a really necessary revolution in therapy, We also need to acknowledge the professional debates and critiques surrounding some of the specific claims made within this very popular perspective.
That's absolutely vital for a balanced deep dive. This model has been transformative for countless people, offering explanations and pathways that resonated deeply. But at the same time, some very experienced trauma therapists, researchers, and clinicians deliberately hold a critical stance or choose not to recommend this specific framework universally. We need to explore those reasons, maintaining that impartial perspective on the content itself.
So what are some of the main points of friction or concern within the wider academic and clinical community? Let's maybe start with accessibility and the way the information is presented.
Okay. One key critique relates to the tone and, frankly, the density of the material as it's often presented. Critics argue that while the intention is clearly to educate and validate survivors' experiences, the heavy emphasis on detailed brain anatomy, complex neurobiology, and scientific jargon can actually be quite overwhelming.
Overwhelming how? For someone already struggling.
Yeah. For someone already struggling with trauma symptoms, maybe feeling fragmented, unsafe, easily flooded, diving into intricate descriptions of brain damage or physiological dysfunction, even if accurate, can sometimes inadvertently increase feelings of hopelessness or of being permanently broken. Phrases like trauma being a physical assault on development, while perhaps scientifically grounded, can feel incredibly heavy and potentially pathologizing if not delivered with extreme care and context.
So the very science meant to validate their struggle might, ironically, make them feel more damaged or irreparable if it's not handled delicately.
That's the concern some clinicians raise. Finding the right balance between providing empowering knowledge and avoiding overwhelming or frightening the reader is tricky.
Okay, what about the scientific validity itself? Are there debates about the evidence used to support some of the claims?
Yes, this is another major friction point. Some experts in the field argue that certain claims regarding specific neurobiological effects of trauma or the definitive superiority of certain treatments over others might be based on evidence that is perhaps mischaracterized, insufficient, or in some cases, outdated.
Can you give an example?
Well, one example sometimes cited is regarding specific physiological markers. For instance, findings like low cortisol levels are sometimes presented as strong evidence for the unique impact of PTSD. However, critics point out that low cortisol is also found in other unrelated conditions like chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia.
So if the finding isn't unique to PTSD, it loses some power as a specific marker for trauma's effects.
That's the argument. It doesn't necessarily disprove the finding in trauma survivors, but it complicates the interpretation and suggests caution against presenting it as a unique hallmark solely of PTSD etiology. Similarly, concerns have been raised about how certain brain imaging findings are interpreted or extrapolated.
And there were also mentions in the critiques about specific citation issues regarding data used to illustrate the pervasive physical effects of trauma.
Correct. Some critical reviews have pointed out instances where specific claims, perhaps about dramatically high rates of certain illnesses like asthma in traumatized populations, were allegedly footnoted to research papers that either didn't actually support the specific claim made or where the data presented was later contested by researchers involved in the original studies.
So issues with how evidence is sometimes cited or interpreted.
That's the critique. It leads to skepticism among some researchers about the robustness of all the neurobiological claims presented, especially regarding the implied permanence of certain brain changes. They might point to conditions like Cushing's disease, where a severe brain impairment caused by excessive cortisol can be medically reversed, suggesting brain changes aren't always permanent fixtures.
This scientific debate naturally leads us into the very vigorous discussion about established therapies, particularly cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. Why is this such a huge point of conflict within the trauma field?
It's a major point of tension because CBT, especially in its trauma-focused forms like prolonged exposure therapy, PE, or cognitive processing therapy, CPT, is backed by decades of rigorous scientific research. It's considered by many major health organizations worldwide to be a first-line, evidence-based treatment for PTSD.
Yet the somatic framework often critiques these top-down approaches, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes citing examples where exposure therapy seemed harmful.
Exactly. Proponents of the body-based approaches often highlight cases, perhaps veterans or survivors of complex trauma, who felt re-traumatized or even worsened by therapies that pushed them to repeatedly recount the details of their trauma narrative too quickly, without sufficient grounding or regulation skills. They argue that for some, this direct verbal exposure is simply too much, too soon.
But on the other hand, the data supporting CBT's effectiveness for many people is also undeniably strong.
It is undeniably strong. Numerous large-scale studies, including massive ones within the VA system, have demonstrated that specialized trauma-focused CBT leads to significant symptom reduction for a large percentage of patients. In some studies, nearly half of the participants no longer met the criteria for PTSD after completing the therapy.
So it's not that CBT doesn't work, but maybe it doesn't work for everyone or requires careful application.
That seems to be the more nuanced understanding emerging. The debate is less about whether CBT can work and more about for whom and when. For some individuals, perhaps those with single-incident traumas and good baseline coping skills, directly processing the narrative and challenging maladaptive thoughts via PE or CPT might be highly effective and efficient.
But for others,
For others, particularly those with early developmental trauma, complex PTSD involving multiple events, or significant dissociative symptoms, attempting that kind of direct narrative exposure without first establishing somatic safety, regulation skills, and internal resourcing, perhaps through the bottom-up methods we discussed, could indeed be ineffective or even harmful.
so the key takeaway here really has to be about individualization. There's no single magic bullet cure for trauma.
Precisely. One size absolutely does not fit all. Knowledge about all these approaches is most valuable when it's used critically and applied thoughtfully to the unique needs and nervous system presentation of the individual person seeking help.
Different people need very different things at different stages of their healing.
Absolutely. For some, CBT might be the key. For others, EMDR, SE, neurofeedback, IFS, or yoga might be essential first steps, or the primary modality needed. Often an integrated approach that combines elements might be best. The choice must be tailored.
And finally, there's one more important critical perspective we need to touch on, the critique that this popular model, with its intense focus on the individual's brain and body, might inadvertently overlook the bigger picture.
That's a crucial contextual point, often raised from social justice or systemic perspectives. Critics argue that by focusing so heavily on the individual's internal nervous system, brain structure, and personal healing journey, the model can sometimes downplay or ignore the impact of intersectionality and broader structural forces that create and perpetuate trauma.
What kinds of structural forces?
We're talking about systemic issues like racism, sexism, poverty, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, community violence, and failures within major institutions like the child welfare system, the justice system, or healthcare systems. These aren't just individual problems, they are societal conditions that inflict trauma and create environments where healing is much harder to achieve, especially for marginalized groups.
So the argument is that a purely individualized lens isn't enough.
The argument is that while individual healing is vital, a truly comprehensive understanding of trauma needs to also account for these larger social, political, and economic dynamics that disproportionately expose certain populations to trauma and create barriers to recovery. To address trauma effectively as a public health issue, the framework needs to be broad enough to include advocacy for systemic change alongside individual therapy.
This has been an incredibly detailed exploration. We've journeyed from the microscopic level changes in the amygdala, the firing of neurons, all the way out to the need for macro-level social and structural change.
It's a vast landscape.
But through it all, we've synthesized that core insight. Trauma isn't just an event that happened to you, it's an imprint left in you, deeply physical.
Yeah.
And therefore, healing requires engaging that physicality, that somatic reality.
Yes, focusing on regulation, on reconnection with oneself and with safe others, and ultimately on reclaiming ownership of one's body and mind through a varied toolkit of methods tailored to the individual.
Recovery is possible.
Absolutely. The brain's capacity for neuroplasticity offers profound hope. It reminds me actually of some of the very early research into trauma, back when concepts like fixed ideas were being explored.
Fixed ideas.
Yes. These were described as intense emotional experiences at the time of trauma-generating subconscious beliefs or automatisms, almost like mental parasites, behaviors, or feelings that operate automatically outside of the conscious personality's control, simply because the original reality was too overwhelming to integrate. These are like those fragments, those shards, still running parts of the show from behind the scenes.
That's a really powerful thought to leave with you, our listener. This idea of hidden legacies from the past, protective patterns, automatic beliefs, fixed ideas that might still be operating entirely on their own, subconsciously influencing your life today, simply because the original experience was too much for your system to fully process and integrate at the time.
So perhaps something to consider today is, What hidden automatic beliefs or behaviors might be running parts of your life? Those fixed ideas from the past that your conscious self has maybe yet to fully understand, meet with compassion, and bring into the light of awareness for healing.
This was it on today's book, guys. And guys, kindly subscribe and follow us for more such insights on various books. And also, do not forget to join our social media community to stay in touch and get updated.